Ooh, my hair looks so great. Hi,
folks. Welcome. My name is Sean Redmiles. I'm the director of the Fauquier History Museum at the Old Jail. And we are here today doing a Q&A session with Dr. Jaime Aprile. She is an archaeologist and professor of anthropology and classics at George Mason University. She's been volunteering with us for months now, going through our collection of archaeological artifacts that we have from the jail, helping us classify them. She'll talk more about that in a little bit. But she had this fantastic idea recently. This is Archaeology Month. October is Archaeology Month. And how often does somebody get the opportunity to ask questions about archaeology to a real archaeologist? I don't think people come in contact with archaeologists all that often, most likely, right? So this is a really great chance for you folks who are coming on the video. If you have any questions for Dr. Aprile, if you've ever had any burning wonder about how to do archaeology, how one does archaeology, how she does archaeology, what it is, throw it up on the comments for us. We will read through them. I will ask Jaime those questions, and then you'll get the answer in real time. And then for folks who are watching later, this is just a good resource for you to use for later on in your life when it comes to come in contact with old artifacts, okay? So we're going to, Dr. Aprile, if you wanted to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and then we'll get into some questions if we have them, and I certainly have some questions myself.
All right, well, hi, everyone. It's nice to virtually see you. I've been an archaeologist probably, I guess, since I took my first archaeology class in undergraduate. I went to Indiana University. I'm from the Midwest. I've moved around the country a lot for my education, and I've landed here in Warrenton, and I really love living here and being able to share my experiences as an archaeologist since I get to work over in Fairfax. And I'm really happy that I can, be around here and be available to all of you for public outreach. It's one of for me, the best parts of my career. I love talking to people about history and archaeology. So my experience mostly is actually in Europe. I got closed out by COVID a few times, so I started working with the Historical Society here and volunteering my time and getting a chance to return to some historical archaeology. I did a little bit in a gap year between undergrad and graduate school. I did some cultural resource management work, and so I've done some public archaeology, basically, in addition to research archaeology, which has mostly been in Europe. But I'm hoping that we can do some fun and exciting things with the collection here at the Old Jail and put together some interesting comparisons of the documentary resources with the archaeological resources for a future exhibit that we'll do a little later after I finish all this work.
Absolutely. There's a lot to do, but we're so excited to be doing it. And actually, why don't you tell them a little bit about that, Jaime, and I can go grab, we can give them like an example of one of the things that you're working on, but why don't you tell them what it is that you've been working on for us these last couple months?
Yeah, so there have been a couple of excavations in the back Old Jail yard, the area where the inmates would spend their time. We also have some historical documentation that they may have kept animals back there. They may have been working on rebuilding parts of the building. They would do maintenance on the building with some of the work back there. So I've been working with some students out who have kindly volunteered to also spend some time with the Historical Society. And we've been going through and basically doing a rough count of things that were found in an excavation from 2009. Dr. Doug Sanford, who was at the time a professor at the University of Mary Washington, he has now retired. He had some students in to do some work out back, and there just never was much done with the collection after it was transferred to the museum here. So I figured I would take his excavation documentation and the collection, and we'd, basically see what we can find, see what we can interpret from those results and how we can match them up with the historical documents.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing for me, guys, is that we're hopefully going to get to draw some conclusions from some of this stuff, right? To match what we know about it in the documents and what we know from research. So, for example, we can go through a couple of these.
Yeah. See if we can find something fun.
Yeah. So these are this is what Dr. Aprile is going through. We'll get more into depth in how, one does this and what the process is and how she's going about doing it. But just, so you can see it. This was dug up from our back exercise yard in the jail. So if you've been to the jail, you know that there's two buildings. There's the back building, and that building has a yard where the prisoners could go to get open air and exercise. And it's from there that we dug all the stuff up. So there's all kinds of stuff in here.
There's some pottery, piece of a plate there, probably a piece of courseware. used for cooking or storing food.
So, like, let's take that for an example here, Dr. Aprile. If you, I've been here while your interns have been working on this. When you pull this out, what is the first thing you're kind of doing when you're looking at this? What are you writing about? How are you describing it? All of that.
Well, so this first round of sorting we've been doing is basically taking a look at objects, counting how many are in each type. And that is basically a full-scale accounting of just everything that is in the museum's collection. That's the first stage of archaeological analysis, always, because you want to know what you have. And we also are going through and relating that information to where the objects came from in the yard. And so the first thing we do is a little bit of rough identification. We'll, count, see if anything is painted or decorated in some other way. We'll make note of any of those special characteristics because those can be very helpful in the future for helping us identify exactly when something was made, because we have pretty good records of the styles of pottery over the last 200 years in the United States. And so we're hoping that with some of our decorated pieces, we might be able to actually figure out to within maybe 20 or 30 years when they were made, and then we can start making a guess as to when they might have gotten thrown away in the old jail yard.
That'd be amazing to get some dates on these.
Yeah.
There's a chance. Dr. April's been telling me that there's a good likelihood that they didn't go all that deep into the exercise yard. So there's a very good chance that there are tons of 1800s era artifacts still in the ground that we can someday get in there and learn more about. And if they can tell us what the prisoners were eating, what they had on them, what they were using, it can tell us so much about the jail and its history. So
we've already found pretty good evidence that we will be able to, once we identify the animal bones, figure out some of the foods that they were eating, because we have some that have very clear indications of cut marks from being butchered in order to be cooked as food.
I didn't know. So that's right. You guys have found butchery marks, and so that does mean, in theory, that that's likely something that they were eating as opposed to just a dead animal that's in the yard. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, cool.
I think I actually have one right here.
Yeah, if you want to show them an example of that real quick, and then we can dive a little bit into some questions that I have for you about overall archaeology.
So let's see. We have here, I'm not great at perfect identifications of faunal osteology. I'm more of a ceramics person, so, and stone tools. But this particular bone, I can't tell you exactly what part of an animal it is, but I do know it is an animal. This nice sharp cut right there, if you look on the inside, you can see that some of the internal structures of the bone are still visible where the basically fatty inside bits would have been. That'll, of course, erodes away after a while when it dries out. But a nice, clean, sharp mark like that, you don't get that from animals. You don't get that from any other sort of natural depositional process. That is someone with a saw cutting through. So it's probably a relatively recent cut. It's probably not from the 1800s. It's probably 1900s.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's cool, guys. I mean, like, that kind of analysis, just being able to look at it like that and get an idea. I almost wonder if we could do one more. Is there a piece of pottery in there other than the one you had before?
That one was pretty much the best one.
Yeah,
Let's see what we have in this one. Is there anything good in this
just kind of like what you did there, because I know I've heard you guys talk about different pottery pieces and what they can tell you immediately about that object. So let's see. There's a couple.
We have several in this one.
Looks like there's some pieces in there.
Yeah, let's see if there's anything good in this one.
And folks, just while we're doing this, if you have a question for Dr. Aprile, drop it in the comments now, and I will read it to her. Steve, I see that you were watching. Thank you so much. He says, hello, Dr. Aprile. So, yeah, thank you for watching. Yeah. So if you have a comment, guys, if you have a question, please drop it, and we will ask Dr. Aprile. We've got her here for a little bit now, so this is your opportunity to ask an archaeologist the burning questions you've always had. So,
oddly enough, this one is, I remember this one from when we were counting. It is a particular type that the glaze, the nice shiny white on the outside, very easily pops off because of the production method. So we actually have lots of pieces of glaze, but we don't know what was on the other side. We don't know what object it might have been because we have very little examples where we have both sides. This one, though, we have a bit of the part of the angle. And what we can do, and I don't know this one off the top of my head, but what we can do is we can basically use a little tool to measure the outside of that angle. We can measure the angle very accurately. And then if we can get a piece that is diagnostic enough, that has a really clear shape mark, and we can compare that to other examples that are complete from books and things like that, then we can basically use a little piece like this and the shape of an angle of a special area on the plate or the rim or the base. And by comparing it to those full examples in museums, we can tell what one little tiny thing would have originally looked like.
That's crazy. Just from that. So here, just so you guys can see, this is the angle that she's talking about. Just this right here could theoretically give us an idea of the shape of the object. I did not know that. That's super cool.
In combination, we have a little rim right there. That's the edge with that little divot right there. That is probably the edge of a plate. That's a relatively consistent plate decoration.
Wow.
But then it's, just a little teeny piece. These will be tough because they're awfully small and they don't have a lot of diagnostic features. But we have some others in some other bags that have a little bit of painting on them, and a few that are a style known as transfer print, which was very popular. That's the kind that you can still buy transfer print today. It's the ones that you might see with something like a Chinese little village, that kind of thing. They were all meant to imitate Chinese porcelain that was being imported in the 1800s. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay.
And then they used that technique over there as well. It's a very economical way to mass produce decorated pottery.
Isn't that a thing that there are blueprinted potteries that you can tell specifically the time, like 1820s, 1840s, because they were mass produced at that time, right? Manufactured pottery or something.
Yeah, you can look at a combination of the shapes, the manufacturing techniques by looking at the broken edges, and the decorative styles and the colors. Those are all factors that we can use as archaeologists to figure out when these things may have been made. Now, when they get dumped in the trash, that's a separate matter. We have to figure that out from the archaeology, not just from the artifacts. You know, we need that larger context. We need the place it came from, the objects it was found with. What other types of architecture or features which are immovable archaeological remains. We have to see what kinds of things like that are in the area to have a sense for when the thing might have actually gone into the trash, into the ground.
Into the ground, right. Well, I know you folks, a lot of you guys live in historic homes, and I know a lot of you have historic properties, so you're certainly going to run into different types of pottery, and we're going to, in a little bit, we'll dive more deeply into what an individual like you guys would do if you were to find that stuff, and how you can kind of apply some of the appropriate methods of archaeology to learn a little bit more about your property. But actually, I think we might have a question here, which is awesome. So Steve says, thank you for your knowledge and expertise, Dr. Aprile. Archaeology has always been an interest of mine. Question, in addition to your education, are archaeologists required to be certified? And if so, what type of certifications are desired? Great question.
Yeah. So there are a number of different ways that you can work as an archaeologist. And there are different sort of levels of work that you can do depending on how much education you have versus how much experience you have. So there is an organization, the Register of Professional Archaeologists, that basically runs the accreditation process in order to be an RPA, which is a person who has both experience and a graduate degree, or you can also register as an RA, which is a registered archaeologist who has a BA and a certain degree of experience. That's the most official accreditation that the United States has. However, there are also some opportunities for individuals who are maybe not trained as archaeologists to actually receive some training.
Oh, cool.
The Archaeological Society of Virginia offers a certification program for folks who want to be local advocates, as well as folks who might want to be trained to work with local archaeological projects. So this is basically a training program for teaching folks what they need to know so that if there is a project in the area, also, folks will get in touch with the Archaeological Society of Virginia and look to see if there are folks in the area who might be able to participate and bring a little bit more expertise than just a volunteer off the streets, right? And so I highly recommend that certification program if you're not interested in going to school for archaeology or going back to school or something like that. It's a really nice way that someone can get some training without having to go back and complete some sort of 4-year degree.
That's super cool. I did not know that existed. And guys, just so you know, I just threw up a link to a resource that Dr. Aprile has provided us today that just went up on our website. It gives you some ideas of places you can go for more information, a little bit about kind of like legal questions, kind of like the one that you just asked there, Steve. Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, isn't this great? Yeah,
that
so
was a
awesome.
Great question.
Great question. Yeah.
And yeah, I do have a link for the Archaeological Society of Virginia on that document. And I do have the certification program mentioned as a sub-bullet point on that.
Amazing. So you can go there, guys, to learn more. Okay, so I want to ask a question then. We've done a little bit about kind of like the back end part of the process of like cataloging and classifying. But let's talk a little bit about the front end process, like the actual digging, because you have done field work before, right, Dr. April?
Yes.
Okay. I'd love to learn more about this. So let's first start with, I think most people, me included, would just be curious to know what a dig is like from, your experience, just kind of like in general. What is the experience of doing that? And then we'll dig into like how, somebody who's an individual who lives on their own property, how they might go about doing a dig on their own property if they were inclined to do so and got certified.
Yeah. So there's, always a local culture to every project, so sometimes the living conditions are a little more rough than others, and that can be a very different experience, whether you're, living in a tent, or, I've lived in hotels, I've lived in rooming houses, I've lived in people's houses that they just rented to us.
Wow.
And so that part of the experience is always a little different. In terms of the way we work, we tend to keep the fieldwork component very encapsulated, right? We try to do it very quickly because there's a lot of erosional factors that can come into play. We also usually, it's expensive to pay a bunch of people, who are trained in various ways to show up all the time, for several weeks. And so, and also when I work in Europe, we really keep it, very, very concise because we have to deal with shipping things overseas, us mostly, our equipment. We can't bring our artifacts back from Europe. That's illegal. But we then have to get all of our data while we are there. So it tends to be a very intensive process. Usually you get up very early, depending on the time of year when it's going to be light. You work throughout the day when it's light, and you excavate the trenches. You lay out very organized grids so that you can always map and mark where you're finding things very precisely in three-dimensional space. And you then collect all of your records, and you keep very detailed notes throughout the process. Every day you fill out forms to cover every single soil layer that you excavate, and you track down where you found the artifacts, those and all the records, and keep a nice organized system like these bags with all this information on them.
Yeah.
Very vital.
Information, guys.
Got to have that information.
Yeah.
Because really archaeology is about information, and people get really excited about objects, but the objects are, I'll say, to be honest, like 10% of what archaeologists do.
Wow.
We really are invested much more so in that whole constellation of information that surrounds the individual object. Yeah. Those pieces of information about where it was found, how it might have gotten there, why it might have gotten there. You can't answer those questions with just the object. You need all of that other information that we record while we're excavating. And so it goes very slowly, and we use hand tools, and occasionally if you understand the stratigraphy well, it is acceptable to use things like backhoes, but that has to be under extremely close control, and you can only do those kinds of things under permitted conditions. And
what is a backhoe?
It's a piece of actual excavation equipment. So if you're on the road and they've got the thing that scoops forward, usually you do the thing with the scoop forward and it scoops down. If you get a really good operator, they can be very precise. And so you could say, I want you to remove 10 centimeters of soil, and they will just go zoop, 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 and then you've got your thing exposed.
Okay.
But you have to know exactly what's in that 10 centimeters of soil and know that it's okay to remove it quickly.
Is there a way to know what's in there before you actually dig it? Okay.
Yeah, we do. We have some testing procedures that we can do where we'll basically dig little sample holes and that are much smaller and quicker, and then we can tell whether or not that's safe. And usually it's in an agricultural context. If there's a lot of plowing that has mixed up the remains, we sample the plow zone for artifacts to see what might be reconstructed from the mixed context, and then we remove it and try to find undisturbed contexts below that.
Wow.
Because really there's a lot of archaeology that is immovable. We have a whole class of finds that we call features that are things like fire pits, houses, ritual centers, shrines, anything that to pick a piece up would destroy the information,
right?
Then that is a feature. And so a lot of times, we are aiming to record the artifacts in relation to the features very specifically. And so we'll record, and the reason we have so many little bags in here is because we don't only have to separate things by object type, but we have to separate by every single context that we excavate. And that means every square on the surface, right, if you thought of it as a grid, as well as the volume of that square. So we record everything from three-dimensional space.
Wow. So much there, but I wanted to. There's so much we could get into. But what this is, I'm just interested again in your experience. I feel like people would want to know this. What is the most interesting object that you have ever encountered in your time working in Europe?
There are several things that are my favorite objects, right? I have one favorite object. It's actually a favorite context from actually the United States, from when I was excavating in Indiana. I found a corner of a probably Mississippian period house, which was really exciting. We did not expect to find something in this area from that culture.
God.
And we think it was Mississippian because they had a special piece of shell tempered pottery from the same site. But then I found this trash pit just right outside the door. Like some person, was like, I gotta have a place to throw my garbage right here, so I could just and I dug a whole raccoon spine, like an articulated raccoon spine, and it was just laying on the side of the pit. Right, I could trace the pit, and the spine was just there, and a deer jaw. That was super cool.
Wow.
So then there's the fancy thing that I found. I was working on a cemetery site in Albania, which is a small country just to the northwest of Greece, if you don't know where it is. And so I was digging a grave because it was a cemetery. And it was from about, I think that grave ended up being about 1000 BCE, so it's quite old. It's basically late Bronze Age for that area. And the person was probably pretty important. She was probably a pretty high status person. We figured out later it was a woman based on the skeleton.
Whoa.
But when I was excavating the skull, there were little pots on either side of her head, and that was very common, that you would put grave goods like right above the shoulders. And one of them had kind of rolled over, and it was very nicely preserved. And I'm digging. I'd done all my photos, all my drawings, all my documentation. I was ready to pick it up, and right underneath it, the little pot had rolled over onto this beautiful gold ornament that had probably been on a piece of cloth. It didn't have any sort of wire to be an earring or something. But that was very exciting. It was one of those kind of moments. And then someone said to me, "Don't say gold in Albanian." And I said, "Well, that's not a problem because I don't know the word."
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's got to be one of those things where most of the time when you're digging, you have a basic idea of what you're about to find and pull out, and that may be one of those rare. You usually know what's about to happen, but that's one of those rare surprises.
Unexpected. We had found lots of bronze. Bronze was totally expected.
Yeah,
we knew gold was possible, but we didn't think that we would find it, especially that high in the tomb as well. We thought it would be lower it was a burial mound, and so as we were going down, we were sort of going down through years, but it was a little more complicated than that. But we thought any gold would be in the very middle and the bottom. And that didn't turn out to be the case.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's amazing. Okay, so wow, that's a good story. So guys, I think one of the things that, I get from a lot of people in Fakir is that, just like we talked about, they find stuff in their property. People do digging. Now, we should say up top that if you have the opportunity and you can get somebody who's certified or a true blue archaeologist to come and do the dig, you should do that. But I know for a fact that people often find themselves digging through stuff anyway, and that's great, and that's totally on you. But if they are doing that, what are some practices that they should consider? If you're let's say you're in the backyard, you found a piece of pottery, you think to yourself, oh my gosh, there might be more back here. Maybe this is a kitchen setup, something that can learn more about the history of my property. What is some advice you could give people on how to go about doing that on their own and what they should think about?
Well, generally speaking, documentation is the most important thing. I strongly recommend you not try to figure it out without some training, because there really is a lot of soil science that goes into archaeology, and a lot of actually kind of geological processes for how things form in soil. And so those are the kinds of things that are really, really hard for avocational archaeologists to be able to perceive, but that's a lot of that contextual data as well. So I give you that as a warning, right?
Yeah.
But I myself live in an old house in town, and I find pottery when I plant things in my yard. And so I have these things too, you know, and I am a very pragmatic person. You know, I recognize that reality is a thing, and we can't all always, you know, find the perfect place to store our collections. You know, I if I gave my collection to the Fauquier History Museum, they would be able to do nothing to it. You know, nothing with it. It would be meaningless.
Doesn't have the information.
Yeah, it doesn't have the information. And so I'm basically curating it and recording where I find it. And I am personally, my choice in this matter as a private property owner, because I do own that house, is to pass it with the house. That's my notion of how to connect the history to the structure, because I don't think of those things as mine. I think of them as part of the archaeological landscape. And that's something that I've developed as a professional that has certain ethical requirements that I have to follow, and as a realist, you know, a pragmatist, and an American who lives under a private property rights regime.
Right.
And so I would say that, you know, if you find some things just incidentally, save them, record where you found them, put them in bags, honestly, clean them up nicely, and try to dry them. Before you store anything, dry. Like, give it so much time to dry, you think it can't possibly be wet anymore, because the pottery will hold an enormous amount of moisture, and it will take a long time for that to come out. And if you don't open your bags then periodically, your pottery will grow moss on its sides, and it'll get like slimy and kind of gross in the bag. So I recommend like really hyper dry things. If you find iron objects, it's really rough to conserve those. They are very likely to just continue rusting. And honestly, one of the best preservation methods for archaeological sites is to not excavate them.
Right.
And that's a very painful thing for archaeologists, and it's a very painful thing for homeowners who are excited and interested. But when you have something stable in the ground to be found, it is in a stable condition. And as soon as you change the conditions at all, even if you make them better, as soon as you change the conditions, the artifact is going to go through stresses. And sometimes those stresses can cause the artifacts to just disintegrate. And so you actually risk a lot of loss by trying to excavate yourself to find information. And so it's much better to have the excavation be a controlled and careful process, so that any information isn't lost on accident, and that you just have some controls over the processing of the objects.
Yeah, we run into that in the museum field too, where there's this idea that anytime you take an object out of its box, anytime you take it out of its bag, you are basically, on some level, decreasing its shelf life and preservation in the future. So, that doesn't mean we don't take it out of the box. We do a video every Thursday where we do, and it doesn't mean we take it out of the basement, but it's just worth considering, like, you kind of weigh what is the informational value that I can get from this object, and the community value of being able to show it versus what could happen to it in the future. Because truly the best way to preserve an object is to just never touch it and always keep it somewhere. But we can't do that. There's stuff that needs to be shown. And it sounds like that's kind of the same thing for archaeology. If there's a lot of really great information that you can get out of that dig site, then you're going to dig, and that is what it is. But
and since digging is so expensive, in a way we sort of stratify the sites by significance, right? And so things like being able to figure out whether something should be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, if it would qualify, then it's more likely to be worth the expense of excavation. Whereas, in my house, like I haven't done any like serious historical research to see if anyone famous lived there yet. But in all the books I've seen of Warrenton, nothing has been mentioned. And I can't imagine I would be the first one to figure that out.
You'd have heard it by now.
Yeah, probably. I think I would have heard it by now.
Yeah.
And so I figure, there's almost certainly no way. It's already blanketed under the regional designation for the historic district in Warrenton. And so I'll just curate that myself, because, institutions like the Fauquier History Museum, they don't have room. There's just no space and materials to store these things safely. And really the best place for them is still in the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, we get a lot of inquiries, a lot for folks who want to donate their archaeological objects to us, which is understandable because they're, the properties are historical, and sometimes it's like, it can be something of real interest to us. But I've sort of gotten to the point where I have to say, like, you got to wow me with what it is because we just are kind of running out of room here. And in some cases, it's just better served staying at the place where it was dug up. If you end up selling the place, then give the objects to the next person. But staying in that location can still be pretty valuable for those objects and keeping them within their context. So let's continue on this a little bit. If folks, I liked that line of thinking of like, I have had questions from folks who were interested in how can I make my house be part of the historic register. It sounds like you're saying that there's a chance that if you are somebody who thinks my house might be, or my property might possibly someday be on the historic register, is there any practices they should do for objects that they find to prepare them for that application in the future? Is there anything that would help them with their application in the future?
Again, the documentation is key. Yeah, if especially if you think you have artifacts that connect to some sort of historical event. Again, significantly, I would say if you do think you have a historical event, it is better not to dig, because you're not going to be able to make the kind of justification for an inclusion on the register from your own opinion, right? There needs to be actual data and documentation of a scientific and historical nature to get onto the register. And so if you do it for fun and then discover something really exciting, you may have ruined your opportunity to get onto the official register, right? Yeah. And so it's better to have an accredited, knowledgeable person come out and check if you think you've maybe found something. There's also quite a few resources on the Archaeological Society of Virginia webpage, as well as some of the states' Division of Historic Preservation websites that I listed on those resources. They have some instructions and some links that you can follow for like a step-by-step sort of evaluation process that you could go through to figure out like maybe what you have and what you maybe want to think about doing with it. But I was just sharing with you my personal choice in how I've dealt with having, pottery in my bush holes. I'm digging a hole to put a plant in a bush. And I found like 40 iron nails. Very inconvenient.
People find bullets all the time.
Scrapped my shovel pretty badly.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay, there you go. So it sounds like you're saying that, if you choose to do it on your own, which again is understandable, then there's a good chance you're going to lose a lot of info and data, and that's you just weigh that with what's going on your property and with what you want to do.
If there is also any sort of potential protection for your site or your house or something being involved in a battlefield or any sort of event that commemorates military history, there are some special rules that apply to those things, even if they are on private property. And so again, you've got to go and consult the resources from the state organizations that have the rules. And one of the links there I've marked clearly is the one that where you're most likely to find the best copies of the rules, because it's the main posting for those regulations.
Nice. All right, so, and again, folks, if you're on here and you have any questions for Dr. Aprile about your experience with archaeology, about her experience with archaeology, how to go about doing it, where to go if you have questions, throw it on the comments for us and we will ask her. But I'm actually wondering, so, one of the things that we're noticing with this project that we're doing that I think is super fun, but I'm curious how this has worked at other times that you've worked with other places. One of the things that's really fun is that her and her interns will be working on something. I'm trying to think of like a good example of something that happened recently. They might find like a piece of, like a piece of whitewash or something like that, right? And I will come in and say, well, you know what? They used to whitewash the building like 4 times a year. It's like one of the main things that the jailer did quarterly during the year. So it certainly makes sense that we're seeing that much whitewash on the ground like that.
Yeah, lots of little bits of plaster in the...
That's it, yes.
Little bits of plaster and mortar. Actually, I was thinking about the shells. I was thinking about the shells yesterday. I had this thought this morning. That maybe some of the shells were there to make that mortar, not from food.
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. That makes sense. So, example, I like even that mortar example. So they were going through like bits and pieces of the mortar, like the stuff in between the stone that kind of holds everything together. together. And I was telling them that in the 1860s, after the Civil War, there was this inspection report to the court, and they basically said that the mortar that held the stones in place was too loose and sandy, and that prisoners, a prisoner named John Butler had escaped by pushing out the stones, basically carving out the mortar and pushing out the stones, going through the wall through the hole that he made, and then climbing up the exercise yard with his blankets and bedroll. And they said that this was the manner that most prisoners had escaped, that they had used in the last 40 years. So, it's an amazing thing in the documents. And so when they said that they had found that part about the mortar, I let them know, the mortar was probably falling off pretty consistently during this time period, and they talk about how loose it is. So the documents and the archaeology kind of came together in a way there, and we're hoping that more of that will happen in the future.
There was a great thing with the mortar, too. We've actually found some chunks that are super soft and some that are much harder.
That's right. So, and that reflects the change that they made.
Yep.
If you go to it now, you're not going to see that type of loose mortar. They did adjust it I think it was at the turn of the century. By the 1890s, they were getting pretty fed up with how easy the jail was to escape from, and they did make some
soft.
changes.
You could scratch it with your fingernail, and they could have just scratched away for a few weeks and
that's
go
what
right
happened in court. They literally talk about it. They're like they you can't. It doesn't have a thing where it says that they did that, but they're like, feel it for yourself, judge and see for yourself how sandy it is. So I'm wondering if in your past experiences, how has that worked when it comes to working on a site and the sort of historians who had the documentation and combining the two? Is that something that happened before you even began the dig? Is it during the dig? Is it after the dig? Is it all of those processes coming together to meld the documents and the knowledge with what you find in the ground?
It kind of depends on what you know when you start, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you know you have historical documentation before you begin, then definitely you consult it first. You want to you want to get all the information that you can before you start excavating.
Makes sense.
And then if you were to find something that would maybe point you toward some historical resources while you work, then you, of course, go and get them, as quickly as you can. You can't always necessarily have them on hand at the same time you're digging, because if you have that encapsulated time frame, you're going to finish your dig and then, go and get them. Now, many of my personal experiences are actually in prehistoric sites, and so we didn't have any historical documentation.
Oh, right.
and a few ones that were of a time period when people did write, they wrote for very, very limited reasons.
Right.
And just by chance, the sites that I worked on didn't have examples of writing. They had only one or two from the entire site over many, many decades of research sometimes. And so I've had, different kinds of experiences where sometimes something like a text is vital for understanding what you're seeing, and other times where you just simply don't have even the possibility of that. And so you have to use, especially theories from anthropology and from other social sciences, to help you try to reconstruct what might have been the behaviors that result in the patterns that you see in the ground. And then you have to just basically create the narrative entirely from the archaeological contextual data, which is all that information I was talking about recording in three-dimensional space.
Wow.
Yeah, so you basically, you look for patterns in those different kinds of distributions of artifacts and distributions over time that accumulate, in the vertical space. And then you try to figure out what the patterns might mean. Right.
So a lot of time it is kind of making educated guesses based on what it is you're finding in the ground, because there isn't just that context to go with it.
It's a scientific process. We write hypotheses. We develop, expectations based on the hypotheses. We excavate to seek data that addresses those questions. Then we see if our data matches our expectations, and if it doesn't, we revise our hypotheses. Classic science.
It's really cool.
The only distinction with archaeology is that we destroy our experiments, right? Because the experiment is the excavation, and you can never redo it. That information is one-time information, which again is why it's really important that you're prepared and ready to go before you dig. If you find a little something, it's better not to say, ooh, fun, and keep going, because you don't know what's happening, and you might destroy all the good stuff before you even realize what's going on.
Well, it sounded like you said before that you guys are often working on time limits, right? Has it ever happened that you're in the course of digging, you find something more that either makes it so that you have to work quicker in order to get it done in the time limit you have, or extend the time limit? Does that happen sometimes?
Yes, definitely.
Okay,
You always find the best stuff on the last day. That's like a joke among archaeologists.
Really?
You
okay.
always find the best stuff on the last day. And it often
no.
happens because you're aiming to go lower in the ground, right?
Right.
You define your space, and then instead of going wider, we'll often go deeper because that's a good sampling strategy, right? To get a better sense of what's happening over time. And
Wow.
so then often the most preserved stuff is at the bottom of the hole, which you're doing at the end just because of physics.
Right.
And so then,
Wow.
yes, you know, I've when I was working in the U.S., we had more opportunities to just extend our time, right? Because
Okay.
we didn't have quite as many restrictions. When I'm working in Europe, our restrictions tend to go with our permits, and so we don't have the flexibility
Right.
to extend our time. And so, and then also, you know, we've all made travel plans and things like that, and so sometimes, you know, those things can't be changed under
Yeah.
the budget. And so then, you know, we work long hours. Yeah, we work extra time.
I was going to ask. Okay.
Basically,
so,
you know,
wow.
an 8-hour field day turns into a 12 or 14-hour field day, and
Oof.
you just get less done in the lab afterward.
Wow. So you have to sort of figure out where can we cut in terms of other work that we have to do later, and then where can we add, and it just becomes a longer day. That's kind of what I was wondering is what happens. Okay. Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Has it ever...
I have some data that is marooned in a box right now in Italy.
Okay. I was going to ask. Okay. So has
because we ran out of time, and I thought, hey, I can get it next year. But next year was 2020.
Oh, no. So it's still there right now.
It's still there right now.
What's going to happen to it? Like
eventually, I will go back. Hopefully.
Okay. And you'll be able to examine it.
and collect the data that I needed. I had all the contextual data from the excavation, but I didn't have time to record all the details of the artifacts.
Is there any chance of losing info in this interim period? Like it's contained in a way that it should be okay?
We've got it all organized.
Okay.
Yeah. We make very careful like storage plans, and everything is neatly bagged up. And we have a storage facility that we're permitted to use in the museum in the town where we work.
Okay. Has it ever happened that you were just fully unable to continue digging, even though there was definitely more left for you to pull out of the site?
There is always more.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Always.
Okay. There always is.
Always. Yeah. You never finish a site, really.
Wow.
I can't think of a single archaeological site that has been begun that isn't very, very small, right? If it's like a little hunting camp or something like that, or maybe a little homestead, you might be able to dig all of it. But usually still there's going to be things around the edges, you know, you're going to have to stop sometime unless you have limitless funding.
Right.
And so, to be honest, the whole world is the archaeological landscape.
Yeah, that's
Everywhere
true.
you go, there's going to be something
You could literally keep digging.
that could, you know, be told
Yeah.
about the past from the archaeological contexts, you know? And so it's really just a matter of figuring out when you've maxed out your research questions, your money, your time, and then you basically just, you know, produce a detailed report and analysis and provide whatever information you can so that if someone comes back later and digs more, they'll have that material available for their background research.
Wow.
So then they'll know more when they start and they can write better research questions.
Amazing. Okay. I wanted to ask a little bit about, and folks, just so I'm going to keep saying it. If you guys have questions, drop them into the comment section for us, and we will ask Dr. Aprile. We've got I'm going to give us about 5 more minutes or so before we wrap up. And of course, this video is available to anybody watching after it was live as a resource. But I'm wondering, what was I going to ask? The phone just rang. Oh man, I had a good question. Well, yeah, do you have anything to add, Dr. Aprile, before I know I had a good one and I'll bring it up in just a second, but we were just talking about digging up. There's never an end. You're always continuing.
There's always more to do.
I remember what it was. Yes. Okay. So is there anything new happening in the field in terms of technology, things that are allowing us to go back to old dig objects and learn a little bit more about them? Is there anything for the future of the field that's kind of happening that somebody like you who's involved in it would know about it that we haven't heard maybe, or just kind of like where is it heading, and if somebody were to find an object in their yard, or I know we've talked about doing some kind of like I think dendrochronology on a wood barrel that we have. What are things like that are happening right now in the field that people might be interested in?
Well, there's a lot of development in technologies being applied to archaeology recently. I'm more of a social theorist myself. I'm excited about the people, but some of the best opportunities right now are honestly in various forms of archaeological science. So people are doing a lot with remote sensing technologies. There's a lot of geophysics being applied. So people are using ground penetrating radar and electrical conductivity and resistivity, and you can tell different things about the subsurface environment before you dig, and then that allows you to target your excavation locations more precisely, so that you're not having to do quite as much testing to figure out where you want to put a bigger trench. You can sort of target your testing more strategically, and then that saves you some time and gets you a chance to dig a little more. A lot of folks are doing some really interesting things with satellite imagery.
Ooh.
People are using satellite imagery. They're creating digital elevation models of the surface of the Earth from satellites, and then you can algorithmically remove plant cover. And so they've been able to find some really exciting things hiding under rainforests, especially in Central and South America. This has been applied pretty well and extensively there, and it could be applied many other places. This is just where they've done a few of these really recent influential projects, and they've found whole extended basically neighborhoods of Central American Mayan cities. That they knew already that there was a pyramid and it's a World Heritage Site and all that, but then if you just look beyond in the areas that the archaeologists haven't really gotten to yet, and it's very densely covered in forest, when you remove that forest cover, suddenly you can find house mounds, you can find like the basic outlines of streets, some of the causeways and things like that. And that has been a really exciting development.
Oh, man.
The other developments go inside the body. Some ancient DNA analyses are really transforming the field in terms of how we can trace things like migration patterns across the landscape. We can do a lot of really interesting things with isotopic signatures in bones to start making estimates of where people grew up versus where they died.
And geographically,
If you have the right conditions in the geology, you can conceivably have different soil chemistry. In your childhood, if you move from your childhood until your adulthood, and the water soil chemistry is different in the two regions. As your bones naturally remodel themselves throughout your life, your bones chemistry from the isotopes will be different than your teeth, because your teeth crystallize and never change after your adult teeth come in. They're fixed forever, whereas all the rest of the bones in your body remodel. And so then you can compare those kinds of isotope levels to figure out if people moved during their lives, which is incredible, because then you can start reconstructing things like, was there a social practice where, women from one community all married into a different community, or like, was there like a wife swapping thing, which is very common between, tribal lineages making social connections by intermarrying, right? Wow. And so you can start tracing those things in the human body. We're also doing some really fascinating stuff with studying human evolutionary processes using ancient DNA as well, which has been really, really exciting.
So your body is a map of where you've been in a way, like
in a way, like. Some parts of it. Yeah, that's
super cool.
I did not know that. You can tell diet as well from some isotopic ratios in the bones as well.
Oh my god, did not know that, guys. So look up more about that, and I know I'm going to when I get on Google. I'm going to learn more, and that's so cool. And let's leave on this because I remember, I think it was you who told me this, Dr. Aprile, that I think it's either radiocarbon dating or dendrochronology that there's this and I think this just speaks to archaeology, and sometimes this it's just such an interesting field. You run into a situation where after the 1940s or something, you can't use, which one is it? Is it radiocarbon?
Yeah, it's radiocarbon dating. Yeah. After the threshold benchmark date that most folks scientists assign, is 1950. Because after 1950, you can't do radiocarbon dating at this time, because not only is it too short of the span for enough carbon to have decayed, but also because nuclear testing in the atmosphere completely skewed the normal patterns in carbon-14 presence in the atmosphere. And so all carbon-14 depositions in living creatures differ categorically after 1950 compared to everything before. So from, basically until they can work out enough data to create calibration curves for our crazy, nuclear testing in the past, no one will be able to do carbon-14 dating for anything after 1950. Wow. It'll take a really significant calibration. But the calibration is possible.
I didn't know
it's just
that.
going to take a lot of time. You know, we've had to calibrate a lot of radiocarbon curves for things like volcanic eruptions.
Right.
Those change the nature of carbon-14 formulation in the atmosphere. It's a natural process that it creates, and it's a natural process that all living things absorb it. And so it's a useful dating method for organic materials. It has to be organic. It has to have been alive to be carbon dated. That's a really important thing. A lot of news will kind of fudge that. They'll say a site or a piece of pottery was, you know, carbon dated. It's because something nearby it was carbon dated.
Oh,
and they inferred the date in relation to that, right? So, you know, that's just a thing to consider. But yeah, carbon-14 dating has some limitations that a lot of the public isn't fully aware of, and so sometimes folks will take those readings as a kind of gospel, but they always have like a standard deviation. They always have a range of error, and so we almost can never get to within better than about, at the very best, maybe 50 years. 25 to 50 years is like the very best we can do, but usually you're running on a span of like a few hundred years for a radiocarbon date, and you just have to hopefully get enough samples that you can get enough overlap in those dates that you can arrive at a realistic estimate. Otherwise, you have to use different methods and try to come to a conclusion by dating things using different methods.
Wow. So there you go, guys. That's amazing. I've learned, even just in this last 40 minutes, I've learned a lot. So thank you so much, Dr. April, for coming and doing this with us.
Thank you all for coming and listening to me.
Yeah, we had a ton of people. This was awesome. This is one of our best videos ever. This is great. So really appreciate you guys coming out. If anybody here who's watching or who watches later is interested in volunteering with the museum, just like Dr. April is, you don't need to be an archaeologist with her skill level. You can just be somebody who knows how to use a computer and is interested in history and research. We have endless numbers of projects that you could help us with. So consider doing that, guys. And if you're not already a member of the Fauquier Historical Society, consider doing that. For just $30 a year, you get free admission to the museum. You get access to our special resources page, of which we may in the future have more archaeological information. And you get just so much more than that, and discounts and whatnot. So consider becoming a member. Thank you, Dr. April, for coming. Happy Archaeology Month, everybody, and everyone have a good weekend.